Chapter 2. Though Joseph Last was by no means a miracle of observation and deduction, he was not altogether the simpleton among his books that Mr. Marsh had judged him. It was not so very long before a certain uneasiness beset him in his new employment. At first everything had seemed very well. Mr. Marsh had been right in thinking that he would be charmed by the scene in which the white house was set. It stood terraced on a hill, high above a grey and silver river, winding in S's through a lonely, lovely valley. Above it, to the east, was a vast and shadowy and ancient wood, climbing to the high ridge of the hill, and descending by height and by depth of green to the level meadows and to the sea. And standing on the highest point of the wood above the white house, Last looked westward between the boughs, and saw the lands across the river, and saw the country rise and fall, and billow upon billow, to the huge dim wall of the mountain, blue in the distance, and white farms shining in the sun on its vast side. Here was a man in a new world. There had been no such country as this about Dunham in the Midlands, or in the surroundings of Blackheath or Oxford, and he had visited nothing like it on his reading parties. He stood amazed, enchanted, under the green shade, beholding a great wonder. Close beside him the well bubbled from the grey rocks, rising out of the heart of the hill. And in the White House the conditions of life were altogether pleasant. He had been struck by the dark beauty of Mrs. Marsh, who was clearly, as Miss Pilliner had told him, a great many years younger than her husband. And he noted also that effect which her cousin had ascribed to years of living in the tropics, though he would hardly have called it weariness or lassitude. It was something stranger than that. There was the mark of flame upon her, but Last did not know whether it were the flame of the sun, or the stranger fires of places that she had entered, perhaps long ago. But the pupil, little Henry, was altogether a surprise and a delight. He looked rather older than 7, but Last judged that this impression was not so much due to his height or physical make as to the bright alertness and intelligence of his glance. The tutor had dealt with many little boys, though with none so young as Henry, and he had found them, as a whole, a stodgy and podgy race, with faces that recorded a fixed abhorrence of learning, and a resolution to learn as little as possible. Last was never surprised at this customary expression. It struck him as eminently natural. He knew that all elements are damnably dull and difficult. He wondered why it was inexorably appointed that the unfortunate human creature should pass a great portion of its life, from the very beginning, in doing things that it detested. But so it was. And now for the syntax of the optative. But there were no such obstinate entrenchments in the face or the manner of Henry Marsh. He was a handsome boy who looked brightly and spoke brightly, and evidently did not regard his tutor as a hostile force that had been brought against him. He was what some people would have called, oddly enough, old-fashioned, childlike, but not at all childish, with now and then a whimsical turn of phrase more suggestive of a humorous man than a little boy. This older habit was no doubt to be put down partly to the education of travel, the spectacle of the changing scene and the changing looks of men and things, but very largely to the fact that he had always been with his father and mother, and knew nothing of the company of children of his own age. "Henry has had no playmates," his father explained. "He's had to be content with his mother and myself. It couldn't be helped. We've been on the move all the time, on shipboard or staying at cosmopolitan hotels for a few weeks, and then on the road again. The little chap had no chance of making any small friends." And the consequence was, no doubt, that lack of childishness that Last had noted. It was, probably, a pity that it was so. Childishness, after all, was a wonder world, and Henry seemed to know nothing of it. He had lost what might be, perhaps, as valuable as any other part of human experience, and he might find the lack of it as he grew older. Still, there it was, and last ceased to think of these possibly fanciful deprivations when he began to teach the boy, as he had promised himself, from the very beginning. Not quite from the beginning. The small boy confessed with a disarming grin that he had taught himself to read a little. "But please, sir, don't tell my father, as I know he wouldn't like it. You see, my father and mother had to leave me alone sometimes, and it was so dull, and I thought it would be such fun if I learnt to read books all by myself." Here, thought Last, is a lesson for schoolmasters. Can learning be made a desirable secret, an excellent sport, instead of a horrible penance? He made a mental note and set about the work before him. He found an extraordinary aptitude, a quickness in grasping his indications and explanations such as he had never known before, not in boys twice his age, or 3 times his age, for that matter. As he reflected, this child, hardly removed from strict infancy, had something almost akin to genius. So the happy tutor was inclined to believe. Now and again, with his "Yes, sir, I see," and then, "Of course," he would veritably take the coming words out of Last's mouth, and anticipate what was, no doubt, logically the next step in the demonstration. But Last had not been accustomed to pupils who anticipated anything, save the hour for putting the books back on the shelf. And above all, the instructor was captured by the eager and intense curiosity of the instructed. He was like a man reading the Moonstone or some such sensational novel, and unable to put the book down till he had read to the very last page and found out the secret. This small boy brought just the spirit of insatiable curiosity to every subject put before him. "I wish I had taught him to read," thought Last to himself. "I have no doubt he would have regarded the alphabet as we regard those entrancing and mysterious ciphers in Edgar Allan Poe's stories. And, after all, isn't that the right and rational way of looking at the alphabet?" And then he went on to wonder whether curiosity, often regarded as a failing, almost a vice, is not, in fact, one of the greatest virtues of the spirit of man, the key to all knowledge and all the mysteries, the very sense of the secret that must be discovered. With one thing and another, with this treasure of a pupil, with the enchantment of the strange and beautiful country about him, and with the extreme kindness and consideration shown him by Mr. and Mrs. Marsh, Last was in rich clover. He wrote to his friends in town, telling them of his happy experiences, and Zouch and Noel, meeting by chance at the Sun, the dog, or the Triple Ton, discussed their friend's felicity. "Proud of the pup," said Zouch. "And pleased with the prospect," responded Noel, thinking of Last's lyrics about the woods and the waters and the scene of the White House. "Still timeo Hesperides et dona ferentes." "I mistrust the West. As one of its own people said, it is a land of enchantment and illusion. You never know what may happen next. It is a fortunate thing that Shakespeare was born within the safety line. If Stratford had been 20 or 30 miles farther west, I don't like to think of it. I am quite sure that only fairy gold is dug from Welsh gold mines, and you know what happens to that." Meanwhile, far from the lamps and rumours of the Strand, Last continued happy in his outland territory, under the great wood. But before long he received a shock. He was strolling in the terraced garden one afternoon between tea and dinner, his work done for the day, and feeling inclined for tobacco with repose, drifted towards the stone summer-house, or perhaps gazebo, that stood on the verge of the lawn in a coolness of dark ilex trees. Here one could sit and look down on the silver winding of the river, crossed by a grey bridge of ancient stone. Last was about to settle down when he noticed a book on the table before him. He took it up and glanced into it, and drew in his breath, and turning over a few more pages, sank aghast upon the bench. Mr. Marsh had always deplored his ignorance of books. "I knew how to read and write, and not much more," he would say, "when I was thrown into business, at the bottom of the stairs, and I've been so busy ever since that I'm afraid it's too late now to make up for lost time." Indeed, Last had noted that though Marsh usually spoke carefully enough, perhaps too carefully, he was apt to lapse in the warmth of conversation. He would talk of facts, meaning facts, and yet it seemed he had not only found time for reading, but had acquired sufficient scholarship to make out the Latin of a terrible Renaissance treatise, not generally known even to collectors of such things. Last had heard of the book, and the few pages he had glanced at showed him that it thoroughly deserved its very bad character. It was a disagreeable surprise. He admitted freely to himself that his employer's morals were no business of his. But why should the man trouble to tell lies? Last remembered queer old Miss Pillener's account of her impressions of him. She had detected a lack of candor, something reserved behind a polite front of cordiality. Miss Pillener was, certainly, an acute woman. There was an undoubted lack of candor about Marsh. Last left the wretched volume on the summer-house table and walked up and down the garden, feeling a good deal perturbed. He knew he was awkward at dinner, and said he felt a bit seedy, inclined to a headache. Marsh was bland and pleasant as usual, and Mrs. Marsh sympathized with Last. She had hardly slept at all last night, she complained, and felt heavy and tired. She thought there was thunder in the air. Last, admiring her beauty, confessed again that Miss Pillener had been right. Apart from her fatigue of the moment, there was a certain tropical languor about her, something of still burning nights and the odor of strange flowers. Marsh brought out a very special brandy which he administered with the black coffee. He said it would do both the invalids good and that he would keep them company. Indeed, Last confessed to himself that he felt considerably more at ease after the good dinner, the good wine, and the rare brandy. It was humiliating, perhaps, but it was impossible to deny the power of the stomach. He went to his room early and tried to convince himself that the duplicity of Marsh was no affair of his. He found an innocent, or almost innocent, explanation of it before he had finished his last pipe, sitting at an open window, hearing faintly the wash of the river and gazing towards the dim lands beyond it. Here, he meditated, we have a modified form of Bounderby's disease. Bounderby said that he began life as a wretched, starved, neglected little outcast. Marsh says that he was made into an office boy or something of the sort before he had time to learn anything. Bounderby lied, and no doubt Marsh lies. It is the trick of wealthy men to magnify their late achievements by magnifying their early disadvantages. By the time he went to sleep, he had almost decided that the young Marsh had been to a good grammar school and had done well. The next morning, Last awoke almost at ease again. It was no doubt a pity that Marsh indulged in a subtle and disingenuous form of boasting, and his taste in books was certainly deplorable. But he must look after that himself. And the boy made amends for all. He showed so clean a grasp of the English sentence that Last thought he might well begin Latin before very long. He mentioned this one night at dinner, looking at Marsh with a certain humorous intention. But Marsh gave no sign that the dart had pricked him. "That shows I was right," he remarked. "I've always said there's no greater mistake than forcing learning on children before they're fit to take it in. People will do it, and in 9 cases out of 10, the children's heads are muddled for the rest of their lives. You see how it is with Henry. I've kept him away from books up to now, and you see for yourself that I've lost him no time. He's ripe for learning, and I shouldn't wonder if he got ahead better in 6 months than the ordinary early crammed child would in 6 years. It might be so, Last thought, but on the whole he was inclined to put down the boy's swift progress rather to his own exceptional intelligence than to his father's system or no system. And in any case, it was a great pleasure to teach such a boy, and his application to his books had certainly no injurious effect on his spirits. There was not much society within easy reach of the White House, and, besides, people did not know whether the Marshes were to settle down or whether they were transient visitors. They were chary of paying their calls, while there was this uncertainty. However, the rector had called. First of all, the rector and his wife. she cheery, good-humored, and chatty, he somewhat dim and vague. It was understood that the rector, a high wrangler in his day, divided his time between his garden and the invention of a flying machine. He had the character of being slightly eccentric. He came not again, but Mrs. Winslow would drive over by the forest road in the governess car with her 2 children, Nancy, a pretty fair girl of 17, and Ted, a boy of 11 or 12, of the type which last catalogued as stodgy and podgy, broad and thick-set, with bulgy cheeks and eyes, and something of the determined expression of a young bulldog. After tea, Nancy would organize games for the 2 boys in the garden and join in them herself with apparent relish. Henry, who had known few companions besides his parents, and had probably never played a game of any kind, squealed with delight, ran here and there and everywhere, hid behind the summer-house, and popped out from the screen of the French beans with the greatest gusto, and Ted Winslow joined in with an air of protest. He was on his holidays, and his expression signified that all the sorts of things was only fit for girls and kids. Last was delighted to see Henry so ready and eager to be amused. After all, he had something of the child in him. He seemed a little uncomfortable when Nancy Winslow took him on her knee after the sports were over. He was evidently fearful of Ted Winslow's scornful eye. Indeed, the young bulldog looked as if he feared that his character would be compromised by associating with so manifest and confessed a kid. The next time Mrs. Winslow took tea at the White House, Ted had a diplomatic headache and stayed at home. But Nancy found games that 2 could play, and she and Henry were heard screaming with joy all over the gardens. Henry wanted to show Nancy a wonderful well that he had discovered in the forest. It came, he said, from under the roots of the great yew tree. But Mrs. Marsh seemed to think that they might get lost. Last had got over the uncomfortable incident of that villainous book in the summer-house. Writing to Noel, he had remarked that he feared his employer was a bit of an old rascal in some respects, but all right so far as he was concerned, and there it was. He got on with his job and minded his own business. Yet now and again his doubtful uneasiness about the man was renewed. There was a bad business at a hamlet a couple of miles away, where a girl of 12 or 13, coming home after dusk from a visit to a neighbor, had been set on in the wood and very vilely misused. The unfortunate child, it would appear, had been left by the scoundrel in the black dark of the forest, at some distance from the path she must have taken on her way home. A man who had been drinking late at the Fox and Hounds heard crying and screaming, like someone in a fit, as he expressed it, and found the girl in a terrible state, and in a terrible state she had remained ever since. She was quite unable to describe the person who had so shamefully maltreated her. The shock had left her beside herself. She cried out once that something had come behind her in the dark, but she could say no more, and it was hopeless to try to get her to describe a person that, most likely, she had not even seen. Naturally, this very horrible story made something of a feature in the local paper, and one night, as Last and Marsh were sitting smoking after dinner, the tutor spoke of the affair, said something about the contrast between the peace and beauty and quiet of the scene and the villainous crime that had been done hard by. He was surprised to find that Marsh grew at once ill at ease. He rose from his chair and walked up and down the room, muttering, "Horrible business, shameful business." And when he sat down again, with the light full on him, Last saw the face of a frightened man. The hand that Marsh laid on the table was twitching uneasily. He beat with his foot on the floor as he tried to bring his lips to order, and there was a dreadful fear in his eyes. Last was shocked and astonished at the effect he had produced with a few conventional phrases. Nervously, willing to tide over a painful situation, he began to utter something even more conventional, to the effect that the loveliness of external nature had never conferred immunity from crime, or some stuff to the same inane purpose. But Marsh, it was clear, was not to be soothed by anything of the kind. He started again from his chair and struck his hand upon the table with a fierce gesture of denial and refusal. "Please, Mr. Last, let it be. Say no more about it. It has upset Mrs. Marsh and myself very much indeed. It horrifies us to think that we have brought our boy here, to this peaceful place as we thought, only to expose him to the contagion of this dreadful air. Of course we have given the servants strict orders not to say a word about it in Henry's presence, but you know what servants are, and what very sharp ears children have. A chance word or two may take root in a child's mind and contaminate his whole nature. It is, really, a very terrible thought. You must have noticed how distressed Mrs. Marsh has been for the last few days. The only thing we can do is to try and forget it all, and hope no harm has been done. Last murmured a word or two of apology and agreement, and the talk moved off into safer country. But when the tutor was alone, he considered what he had seen and heard very curiously. He thought that Marsh's looks did not match his words. He spoke as the devoted father, afraid that his little boy should overhear nauseous and offensive gossip and conjecture about a horrible and obscene crime. But he looked like a man who had caught sight of the gallows, and that, Last felt, was altogether a very different kind of fear. And then there was his reference to his wife. Last had noticed that since the crime in the forest there had been something amiss with her, but again he mistrusted Marsh's comment. Here was a woman whose usual habit was a rather lazy good humor, but of late there had been a look and an air of suppressed fury, the burning glance of a jealous woman, the rage of despised beauty. She spoke little, and then as briefly as possible, but one might suspect flames and fires within. Last had seen this and wondered, but not very much, being resolved to mind his own business. He had supposed there had been some difference of opinion between her and her husband, very likely about the rearrangement of the drawing-room furniture and hiring a grand piano. He certainly had not thought of tracing Mrs. Marsh's altered air to the villainous crime that had been committed. And now Marsh was telling him that these glances of concealed rage were the outward signs of tender maternal anxiety, and not one word of all that did he believe. He put Marsh's half-hidden terror beside his wife's half-hidden fury. He thought of the book in the summer-house, and things that were being whispered about the horror in the wood, and a loathing and dread possessed him. He had no proof, it was true, merely conjecture, but he felt no doubt. There could be no other explanation, and what could he do but leave this terrible place? Last could get no sleep. He undressed and went to bed, and tossed about in the half-dark of the summer night. Then he lit his lamp and dressed again, and wondered whether he had better not steal away without a word, and walk the 8 miles to the station, and escape by the first train that went to London. It was not merely loathing for the man and his works, it was deadly fear, also, that urged him to fly from the White House. He felt sure that if Marsh guessed at his suspicions of the truth, his life might well be in danger. There was no mercy or scruple in that evil man. He might even now be at his door, listening, waiting. There was cold terror in his heart, and cold sweat pouring at the thought. He paced softly up and down his room in his bare feet, pausing now and again to listen for that other soft step outside. He locked the door as silently as he could, and felt safer. He would wait till the day came and people were stirring about the house, and then he might venture to come out and make his escape. And yet, when he heard the servants moving over their work, he hesitated. The light of the sun was shining in the valley, and the white mist over the silver river floated upward and vanished. The sweet breath of the wood entered the window of his room. The black horror and fear were raised from his spirit. He began to hesitate, to suspect his judgment, to inquire whether he had not rushed to his black conclusions in a panic of the night. His logical deductions at midnight seemed to smell of nightmare in the brightness of that valley. The song of the aspiring lark confuted him. He remembered Garraway's great argument after a famous supper at the Turk's Head, that it was always unsafe to make improbability the guide of life. He would delay a little and keep a sharp lookout, and be sure before taking sudden and violent action. And perhaps the truth was that Last was influenced very strongly by his aversion from leaving young Henry, whose extraordinary brilliance and intelligence amazed and delighted him more and more. It was still early when at last he left his room and went out into the pure morning air. It was an hour or more before breakfast time, and he set out on the path that led past the wall of the kitchen garden, up the hill, and into the heart of the wood. He paused a moment at the upper corner and turned round to look across the river at the happy country showing its morning magic and delight. As he dawdled and gazed, he heard soft steps approaching on the other side of the wall, and low voices murmuring. Then, as the steps drew near, one of the voices was raised a little, and Last heard Mrs. Marsh speaking. "Too old, am I? And 13 is too young. Is it to be 17 next, when you can get her into the wood? And after all I have done for you, and after what you have done to me?" Mrs. Marsh enumerated all these things without permission, and without any quiver of shame in her voice. She paused for a moment. Perhaps her rage was choking her, and there was a shrill piping cackle of derision, as if Marsh's voice had cracked in its contempt. Very softly, but very swiftly, Last, the man with the gray face and the staring eyes, bolted for his life, down and away from the white house. Once on the road, free from the fields and brakes, he changed his run into a walk, and he never paused or stopped till he came, with a gulp of relief, into the ugly streets of the big industrial town. He made his way to the station at once, and found that he was an hour too soon for the London express. So there was plenty of time for breakfast, which consisted of brandy.